Andy, we hear this term cancel culture all the time. I'd say it's pretty ubiquitous, but you've definitely got some personal experience with it. For me, could you just share your story briefly, what you experienced and where you're at today?
Sure. And thanks for having me on, guys. It's good to be with you. So I'm a journalist by trade. I went to work when I was 18 on my local paper, then followed a fairly well-worn path to national papers here in the UK, worked on The Sun as a reporter, as a showbiz reporter actually for many years, then became an exec, worked my way up to being the editor of the News of the World, which at that time was the biggest selling Sunday newspaper in the world. Was the editor there for 4 years, pretty successful actually, until I wasn't. Won a lot of awards, sold a lot of papers. And then one of my reporters was arrested, jailed, in fact, for breaking the law, for intercepting people's communications, phone messages. And I resigned. I wasn't asked to, but I felt it was the right thing to do. I found it impossible, really, to be in that job, given what had happened. So left the newspapers, not quite sure what I was going to do next. And then I was offered a job by the Conservative Party here in the UK. In fact, the original job was to be the chief exec of the Conservative Party, which I didn't much fancy. I was more interested in the comms side, as I've always been, and as a result, I became the director of communications and planning for David Cameron, who at that stage was in opposition. And so I worked with him for 3 years, up and down the sort of election hill. Not quite sure when that general election would come, but it did come. When it did, we managed to get over the line. Into a coalition government, but over the line and into Downing Street, where I worked for another year. But then those newspaper issues that I mentioned came back, perhaps partly as a result of my being in Downing Street. And I found myself resigning for a second time. I am a resigning recidivist. And the reason that time really was much the same. I just felt I couldn't do my job. Actually, what I said at the time was, when a spokesman needs a spokesman, it's a good sign that you should probably move on. And so that's what I did. But those issues sort of, pursued me. And about 6 months later, that resulted in it becoming a very high profile scandal. And I spent the next 5 years dealing with there are a fair number of legal issues, but in essence, three very significant issues. I succeeded in two. I failed in one. And that resulted in my going to prison for just under 5 months, including a couple of months in a high security prison, Belmarsh. Came out of my troubles, I suppose, in 2015. And then I had a choice. I could either, and it's interesting perhaps, in the context of this conversation about cancellation, I had a choice of whether to sort of become even more notorious, get out in the TV studios, start kicking some shins, telling my stories, write a book, all that stuff, or follow what was always my original plan, which is see if I could set up a business and see if I could put all of my experience, and obviously I had a whole load of new experience by that stage, and put it to work, for on behalf of my clients, and also, which is the reason why I took that, that second route for myself, because I think this is crucial when you're looking at cancellation. You have really got to work out. It is actually an opportunity to work out who you are, what you're about, what it is you want to do with your life. And I was very clear that I did not want to be that guy sat on a breakfast TV studio sofa, trying to be relevant and trying to, kick a few shins along the way. It's just not who I am. It's never who I was. And so although it's been it's been a perhaps a slower path to follow, if you like, in some ways, it's definitely been the most rewarding one.
I mean, it's a fascinating journey that you've had, Andy, and that's probably why you're so good at what you do. I mean, I listened to your podcast, Crisis What Crisis, and what strikes me is just the empathy that you have when you have your guests, because you've, of course, unlike many of us other sort of crisis practitioners, we haven't been through what it feels like to be in the eye of the storm. And my God, have you been through it? And so that empathy that you have, that emotional intelligence that you have, because clients aren't just looking for a prescriptive response to the crisis, they're also looking for, I imagine, understanding and a feeling of safety from somebody who's been there, done that.
Well, that's very kind. I mean, I don't think my experiences are unique. And funnily enough, doing the podcast has shown me that they're actually they weren't that serious either. In some ways, it might sound a ridiculous thing to say when you're sort of removed and dismantled for 5 years, as I was. But honestly, that I've now chatted to over 100 people who've been in crisis, involved in crisis, mostly personal. And honestly, I don't think there are any that I would say have had an easier time than me. All of them are more difficult, and that's another learning for me. It's all perspective. But yeah, I suppose I think as a result of my experiences, I get to the point of trust pretty quickly with my clients, because I think they all know my background. Perhaps we'll get onto that as to the sort of impossibility of getting out from under when you've been involved in a public scandal these days. And there are reasons for that, perhaps, that we can chat about. So my clients come into the room knowing full well who I am and what I've been through. And so we get to that point of trust pretty quickly. And I think that has been useful. I think that has been valuable. And it's actually the reason why I do what I do. I think, we all do it in different ways, don't we? But when you're sat with someone in a professional context, and they are telling you their story and asking you for your advice in it, I think that's a very privileged position, and it's work absolutely that I love.
Let me follow up on that then. How do you? Let's do it right now. How do you get out from under a cancellation? How do you make that comeback? And let me ask: is it different for different people? And even put forward, is it different for someone in the UK as opposed to Americans? Are they different cultures that come back in different ways?
I think there is a difference. I sort of hesitate slightly to answer, because although I've worked, in the US over the years, I've never lived there, and so I wouldn't claim to be an expert. But I think that the American environment is slightly more forgiving. I think that Americans enjoy the comeback perhaps a bit more than we do here in the UK. You've got a great shining example of that right now with with Donald Trump's return.
So maybe a bit too much at times. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe that's a subject for a different podcast. I don't know, but I think it's got some irony for me, of course, because I was a British newspaper man, right? So I'm the last person to complain about it. And my newspaper career ended very badly. And I've been in the media here a fair bit, right? Having lumps kicked out. But I'm not going to moan about that. I think that'd be grossly hypocritical. And I'm also, despite all that, I remain, I love the British media. I love its skepticism. I love its cynicism. Thank God for it, particularly in the political context. It's a critical part of our life here in the UK. But I do think we're more judgmental. I do think, the battle to keep yourself or to at least get yourself into the grey rather than being in the black or the white, which is where, particularly if you spend your time on social media, that's where you're going to be. You're going to be one or other. None of us are. I've yet to meet anyone who's either wholly in the black or wholly in the white. Most people are somewhere in the grey, some perhaps a little bit darker grey. And so I think here that's a bit tougher. But there's another reason why it's difficult to get out from under, more difficult these days, that I don't think has got anything to do with geography, and I think is equally relevant in the US as it is in the UK, and that's just technology, right? When I was a reporter and I wanted to write a story about someone, then a messenger would be sent down to the library, a file of cuttings would be brought up, I would then rifle through those cuttings, and I'd make a judgment on what I wanted to use, what I didn't want to use, what was relevant and what wasn't. Quite often, by the way, a cutting would go missing, and so you'd miss a large part of someone's history. These days, not only is it readily available to you, instantly available to you, it's served up as though it happened yesterday. And again, not a complaint, but the algorithm that we all now share our lives with is serving this stuff up as though it's a newspaper that gets posted through a door every morning, right? Even though it happened in 2014, and I speak from personal experience. So that takes you to two things for me. It takes you to don't try and approach your problems through the door of reinvention, right? Do not think that you can just somehow hide from the mistakes you've made. And in my case, by the way, I made plenty. Don't think I broke the law, but I made plenty of mistakes. Don't try and hide those. Don't try and deny them. Don't try and reinvent. I am a firm believer, both from a strategic point of view and for what it's worth from a philosophical point of view, that you got to carry your mistakes with you, right? Because that's all part and parcel of being a human being. I also think it's strategically sensible. because you behave in that way. I think you've got a much better chance of getting listened to, and I think you'll be happier doing it.
You said something that's really interesting, because back in the day, if there was a controversy, you'd have to, it'd be printed in the newspaper, and then the next day it would be used for sort of, I don't know, fish and chips wrapping or whatever. And then now, of course, you could just Google someone, but actually it's become even easier than that. You've got ChatGPT, so they could then go and extract all the information from a sort of a whole plethora of websites and sources to sort of get some information. Of course, there's elements of disinformation and misinformation that you have to navigate. But on the other hand, is it easier for people to rehabilitate their reputations, because actually the attention span isn't what it was? The fact that there's so much information that's coming through, and back in the day, I mean, I remember with the politician, so John Profumo, and and after he had his sort of controversy, he ended up for years in charity, and now you see politicians having all sorts of scandals, and the next day it's like all forgotten. So do you think the news cycle has changed, that things aren't sticky anymore, that actually we've got such a tsunami of information, and we just don't have that attention to think, and also perhaps our recall is impaired, or maybe we just don't care anymore?
I think that's absolutely the case. The point about there being an attention deficit is very important in the context of reputation and cancellation. And it is on the to some extent or another a positive, but it kind of depends what the nature of the scandal is, and the nature of the difficulty, or the nature of the cancellation. I think in a political context, I think you're right. Memories are shorter. It is therefore easier to punch through, potentially, but equally the judgment comes much quicker than it did before, right? So it's a balance, isn't it? And so you've seen careers ended here. There's an MP here who, who got in a moment of madness, kind of hit out on someone in the street. He's done, finished. That is all over. 10 years ago, that would have been a much slower process, I think. And who knows, maybe he would have been able to kind of find a way to kind of manage that. He's done, actually, I think, as an MP, and he's acknowledged that himself. So I think it kind of depends in the corporate context. I think memories are a bit longer, actually. I think that, I think it's a dangerous presumption to make when you are in an organizational crisis, or your organization is in a crisis, to think that you can keep your head down, attention will move elsewhere, and people will move on. I think that's a dangerous game to play. I'm sure there are examples where, you've been able to pull that off. That's not really my approach. My approach is always lean into it, confront it, and then be, authentic and consistent. And consistency is so important in trying to address it.
For me, it feels like the battleground has shifted to the beginning of the crisis. I'll give you an example. President Trump gives a State of the Union speech. I go on X or Twitter, and I'm filled with commentators trying to dictate the narrative to me. It's good. It's bad. They're trying to set the narrative, because that's where the stickiness happens. Do you detect the same thing?
Yes, I think there's some truth to that. I think we've got to be careful about using politics as some kind of laboratory for crisis management, right? Because I think it sits more now than ever separately, right? I do not want to, and let's not get into personal politics here, but Donald Trump is not a mentor in my life, I can tell you, right? But he's had tremendous success, right? Tremendous success, is undeniable success in the way that he has handled himself and handled his, whether you agree with him or not, whether you agree with the methods that he deploys, it has undeniably been successful. But it's not a model for my life, and I suspect it's not a model for a lot of other people's lives. And then if you put it in the corporate context, we were going to start encouraging people to run their businesses in the way that Donald Trump has run his political campaigning? Interesting. And in fact, that is exactly the debate that is happening right now, right? Because of course, with his arrival, you saw a whole army of businesses changing strategic changing strategic direction overnight. Let's see how that plays out. Because if you want to tie yourself so inextricably to politics or to a political leader, good luck with that. If you want to stay in business for the next 20, 30 years, you want to stay in business for the next 10 years.
I guess it's about short-term versus long-term. You touched upon something really interesting about sort of polarizing sort of political extremes. And and corporates are now sort of slightly forced to take positions, or they find themselves sort of, feeling as if they and before it used to always be this sort of thing whereby corporates would be like, we're not getting involved, and then all of a sudden with the Black Lives Matter, you started seeing corporates edge into these culture wars, and and then now with Trump, it's full on, which side are you on? But I wanted to talk a little bit about polarization in terms of you now have a split with stakeholders. So, for instance, if you take sort of throughout history, it's quite black and white. Thou shalt not kill. Somebody kills someone, that's a pretty bad thing. But then you have the killing of Brian Thompson. And then you have, all of a sudden, you see these people celebrating Luigi Mangione. And, even in London, there was this graffiti all over sort of East London where they started doing a sort of an ode to him, almost, with a sort of a halo on his head. And so we're now entering this world where actually it just feels a little bit topsy-turvy. So how do you advise your clients when the basics of sort of binary good and bad, it's just not playing out anymore?
I think if you try and dictate your strategy entirely by the environment, you will get caught out, because the environment, as you've just demonstrated, changes so quickly. You just got to work out who you are, what your purpose is, why are we here, what is it that we do, and then for me, it's in many ways it's all about trust, right? And for me, trust actually is a pretty straightforward exercise, right? Do what you say you're going to do, and stay consistent, right? Mean what you say. Just stick to that, and the environment will change, certainly at a pace in the way that you've just described around you. But if you just stay fixed on that simple idea, you'll always find a way to build trust. But it does depend. It does depend who you are. Depends on the nature of the problem that you're dealing with. Depends on what it is you're trying to achieve, either as an individual or as a business. But I think that's a truism regardless, isn't it?
That part feels like it hasn't changed. That feels like the part that's been on forever and ever and ever. That we define our principles as organizations or as personal brands, and we live up to those, we declare them, and we live up to those principles, whatever they are.
Yeah, exactly.
In a way, Trump has his own principles, and
Yes,
he lives up to them.
he does.
And so it's really quite interesting, because if Trump then started sort of, talking in a completely different style, and, and bringing on, the use of experts and I don't know what, and press conferences at the New York Times, people would then, the trust in him would just decimate. So it doesn't matter what you stand for, I guess. It's really about consistency and alignment.
I think it's, as I say, I think it's about what is it that you're trying to achieve, and I think what he wanted to achieve was very straightforward: was to become the president of the United States, and then to become the president of the United States again, and that's what he has stayed laser focused on. Now, who knows what actually matters to him now? But I suspect actually it's legacy. I suspect, say what you like about Donald Trump, but I think family actually. This is a man who stands on stage with his family wrapped around him at every opportunity. Now, maybe there's some cynicism in the back of that. I'm not so sure it's entirely cynicism. Talks about his family a lot, the way he got his son involved in the campaign, who, by the way, made a brilliant strategic decision in getting him to go on Joe Rogan. There's something there, right? And legacy is clearly important to him.
Andy, I've really enjoyed meeting you. Appreciate your time today.
No, thanks for having me on, guys.